Okay, so I am starting this book called What is Climate Change? It's a nice book, has a lot of material, and if I don't know how you're following this course, whether you are following all the chapters. Now I am in section 10. I started, with introduction to weather, climate, energy balance, and then we talked about some general things like glaciers and so on and so forth. But this is going to be a set of lectures or podcasts based on this book because it has 13 chapters, and I have taken the book as it is and added some things that I think need clarification. And this is written by Gail Herman, who's an American, because you will see that everything discussed in this book is focused on America, very specific to America in many ways, even though climate change is a global issue, and we will discuss global things as well. And the cover of the book is, of course, a broken sea ice that the polar bear is sitting on, and you've probably seen many such images before where climate change is usually shown with some broken sea ice in the Arctic with polar bears struggling, some skinny polar bears as well, because they are having a hard time finding food. It's supposed to give you a kind of a shocking image of how bad climate change is. And this started, the polar bear and the Arctic ice thing started a few decades ago, maybe well before you were born, and then slowly people realized, the communication experts and the climate scientists. Climate scientists are not necessarily communication expert. I'm an engineer turned climate scientist, and I am not an expert in climate communication, even though I write in the media and I'm teaching you this course and I teach at colleges and universities and so on. Communication is when you are trying to talk to people who are not experts, and you are the kids. These podcasts are meant for the kids, and you have to tell me whether I'm doing a good job of communicating this at all. Okay, so anyway, it was found that the broken sea ice and the polar bears was not working so well, so they're now using various other methods of trying to communicate the dangers of climate change, our impact on the planet through climate change, and our activities that lead to climate change, the urgency of climate change, and you will hear words like climate crisis and so on. I'm not a big fan of trying to scare you, because your children, you need to grow up thinking exciting things about your future, read about people planning to go to Mars, to Moon, and beyond the solar system, and so on. And you don't want to worry about climate change as if it's going to bring the planet to an end. That's not going to happen. Okay, so in this book, the topics covered are: what is climate change? We will start with that, and then I'll add some details on what do you mean by change, how do you define change. Things are heating up, so we'll look at how global warming is happening. Something in the air, we will look at pollution. Climate change through the ages. Basically, it means, we already talked in the previous sections, but let's say you haven't seen the previous sections. We'll again look at how Earth has evolved over time and how climate has changed in the past. And how far back can we go? Actually, we can go back quite far using detective work that we talked about before in other sections, about what evidence exists from the past that tells us what the climate was like in the past, what the temperature was like, what the carbon dioxide level was like, how the land configuration was, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about the change begins, means when we say climate change, when did it begin to change? It's not exactly like a particular day that it happened, but in general, we know when we started to have bigger and bigger impact on the climate. Measuring up, how do we measure carbon dioxide mainly, and then also other things like past climates. So vicious circles, what does it mean? We have talked about this in terms of feedbacks. We talked about a system, we talk about feedbacks, which means you do something and then some reaction happens, and that reaction makes what you did worse, and then it makes the reaction worse, and then you get into this vicious circle. So are we in a vicious circle? If we are using coal and petrol and gas and increasing greenhouse gases, which we have discussed before, and those greenhouse gases are warming, is that warming going to make more greenhouse gases and hence more warming, and so on and so forth? So many vicious circles exist. Is it real? Is climate change real? Why should you believe that climate change is happening, and who is responsible for it? It turns out that this is a difficult question, and not everybody is on board with this idea that climate is changing and we are responsible and it is urgent and we must do something. Well, we must do something is always tricky, because if somebody tells you climate is changing so you must not travel, then it begins to become, is it really changing so much that I have to stop traveling? I have to stop eating meat? I have to buy fewer new clothes, and so on and so forth. So there is a whole politics of climate change and extreme weather. We will define what extreme weather is. We looked at it a little bit before in other sections. Heat waves, maybe you already heard of it, especially if you live in, let's say, Western US or Africa or US or India or Southeast Asia or Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. Famine and fire. Maybe you know what is famine, you know what is fire, but what are we talking about in this context? So we'll talk about that. Trouble at sea. What is happening in the ocean because of climate change? What can we say about it? And who's suffering because of change at the sea? When you say trouble at sea, somebody must be suffering, and we'll see who that is. The present and the future. So we talk about the past climate change, and then we say at present we are changing climate already because of all the things we are doing, which means where are we headed into the future as far as climate change is concerned? Why do we worry about it? Because you are the kids, you are the future is yours. We must worry about it. I don't have children anyway. I have a godson, Carter, but I have to worry about Carter's future, the environment for Carter as he grows up, the climate for Carter as he grows up, and then we'll look at some photographs which show some changes and some things we are doing, and then we'll look at timelines of climate change. Okay, so here is to start with, again, the polar bears and the broken sea ice. They look a little healthy here, but very soon we'll look at a polar bear that is skinny and sitting on a sea ice chunk that is sitting in the middle of nowhere. And you know that polar bears walk around on sea ice, and then they have to find food and catch the seals that are popping their heads out of these holes in the sea ice, and so on and so forth. So what happens if sea ice disappears? It's not like polar bears cannot swim, but they need sea ice to stay on and wait and hunt, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what is climate change? We'll start reading a lot of things, and we'll look at few figures, and I'll add some words, I'll add some material that's not from this book, and so on. In the Canadian Arctic, well, you know where Canada is, very close to the North Pole. In the Canadian Arctic, so part of Canada extends into the Arctic Circle. Winter used to come early. By early November, temperatures dipped below zero. Snow covered the ground. Hudson Bay became covered in solid ice. Hudson Bay is a water body, and it got covered with ice by the time fall came, even before the winter set in. Hundreds of polar bears lumbered onto the frozen water, making their way out to open ocean. All winter long, they swam from ice floe to ice floe, Floe, ice floe are these little things that are broken off. We won't talk about how sea ice is formed. Basically, ocean water is frozen, and we talked about this before. When the water freezes, ocean water has a lot of salt in it. The salt is gone out of the ice. Ice is very fresh, very little salt in it, and so on and so forth. All winter long they swam, so hundreds of polar bears lumbered onto the frozen water, as we said. All winter long they swam from ice floe to ice floe. They mated. They have to reproduce, of course. They hunted and they fished. There were plenty of ringed seals to eat, which, they stay in the water. They also stay on ice, and they swim around, eat their fish, and then they come out on the ice floe and say, I will rest a little bit after eating all these fish. And then there is the polar bear saying, welcome my friend, and boom, you are gone. When summer finally came in August, the ice melted. This was the natural cycle. The polar bears swam back to land. Remember, we are in the boreal summer and boreal winter because we are in the northern hemisphere. Boreal means northern hemisphere, things like boreal winter, boreal summer. So August is end of summer, or middle of summer. Finally summer comes in the Arctic in August, even though we get summer in India in March, April, May. So as you go to higher latitudes, it remains cold till May, and then June, July begin to warm up. August gets to peak warming, and then the sun begins to go south again from the Tropic of Cancer, and so on and so forth, right? So when summer finally came in August, the ice melted. Polar bears swam back to land. The males play fought. The females watched over their young cubs. Play fight means they teach their kids how to survive and how to play, to learn. It's like if you are a boy, you are fighting with your brother, or your sister and your sisters are fighting. We grow up fighting as well to learn how to share and how to get scolded by the parents, and so on and so forth. So females watch fondly over their young cubs. Months passed. Polar bears lounged on tundra. Tundra is the forest at cold temperatures, as opposed to the mango tree outside my window and the tropical forests and the pine trees in the temperate forests. And then you just get these little shrubs and grasses called the tundra that you can look up on the web and find them. So polar bears lounged on tundra, still frozen ground, using little energy. They waited for cold weather. They waited to go out to sea again, right? So this is the life cycle of the polar bears. They have evolved to live in this cold, miserable temperatures and use the sea ice, the tundra, the land, and the water and the seals and so on to, make their families grow up, and then they die and new generation comes, and this is going on for a long time. And then along came the human beings. There is the polar bear, massive creature. This is a westerner, a healthy Canadian, standing at 6 foot something, so you can imagine how big this polar bear is. This is a beast, very big beast. You don't want to get anywhere near him. He's going to maul you, so you have to be careful. So let's come back and talk more about the polar bears and the climate change. Okay, so we'll cover the whole book like this. Each chapter maybe just one podcast or multiple podcasts. I do it as podcasts, which means it's a video of a few minutes, because the attention span of kids can be 7 to 15 minutes. In school you may have a class that goes on for 1 hour, but the teacher is trying very hard to keep your attention. You're drifting away, daydreaming, and so on and so forth. So this is on YouTube, so you can turn on and turn off anytime. You can watch all of the podcast at once, or you can stop in the middle and take a break and come back and listen again, and so on and so forth. So we'll see you in the next podcast and talk about the polar bears. So we have started our journey into what is climate change anyway. Okay, see you in the next podcast.